Please stand. So this is one of the Gospels that we hear very, very often. I would ask you, though, to not stop listening at the very beginning, because we know how the story goes. If you could simply draw your heart and your mind to what is being said as though you've never heard it before. Luke writes, tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus, but the Pharisees and the scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them, Jesus addressed this parable. A man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to the father, "Father, give me my share of your estate that should come to me." So the father divided the property between them. After a few days, the younger son collected up all of his belongings and set off to a distant country, where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he found himself in dire need. He hired himself to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend to the swine. He longed to eat his fill of the pods of which the swine fed, but nobody gave him anything. Coming to his senses, he thought, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough to eat? But here I am dying of hunger. I shall get up and go to my father, and I'll say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would one of your hired workers.' So he got up and he started back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He, the father, ran to the son, embraced him and kissed him. His son began to say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' His father ordered his servants, 'Quickly, go, bring the finest robe and place it upon him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take that fatted calf and have it slaughtered, and then celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost, but now he is found.' Then the celebration began. Now, the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked him, 'What's going on?' The servant said to him, Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fatted calf, because he has come back safe and sound.' This older brother became angry and refused to enter the house. So his father came out and pleaded with him. The father said, 'Look, come in.' And the son said, 'All these years I served you, and not once did I disobey any of your orders. Yet you didn't even give me a young goat to celebrate with my friends. But when your son returns, having swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughtered the fatted calf?' The father said to him, 'My son, you are here with me always, and everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice. Your brother was dead and has come to life again. Your brother was lost, but has been found.'" The gospel of Christ. Praise be to you, O Christ. Please be seated. So good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
The only time that you divide wealth, the only time you would divide an estate is when the father passed away. The only time you divide any belongings in the Mediterranean, Mideastern world is when the father dies, and then the father's will, his intentions, are fulfilled. By the son going to the father and saying to the father, give me my share of the inheritance, he is basically telling his father that you are dead to me. Give me what belongs to me. Now, you can imagine the horror and the shock for the father to hear a son, his own child, speak in such a way. And it's not like he had any plans. It's not like he was going to take the money and invest it or any of those things. There was no conversation. He just wanted to get away, from his father. So the father, which clearly he did not have to fulfill, there's no demands, there are no authority on the part of the son's request to fulfill that, nothing. But the father loves him so much. And if this is what he wants, he's willing to do that even though it grieved him deeply. And you can imagine the conversations, laying with his wife at night in bed, and the wife saying, what's wrong with him? What's going on? What's happening? Why is he acting like this? The father loves the son so much that he respects his request, divides the property, gives him his share, and then the son goes off. While the son's off, running around with what we know is prostitutes and loose living and parties and celebrations, he burns through all of his cash. Now he has nothing. And now he is also in Gentile territory. See, he's a Jew. And as a Jew in Jewish territory, they do not have pigs. They don't eat swine. So we know that he's outside of his own territory. So he is not surrounded by his people. He's not surrounded by his father, his family. He's not surrounded by his God in the religious, cultural sense of being able to worship. He is in a foreign place, and he, because of hunger, sheer hunger, ends up going to try to work for somebody so that he can sustain himself. But even there, he realizes that no one is willing to give him any food. So he's doing all this work, and he's just about surviving. And his survival skills, not his good intentions, not his desire to reconcile, his survival skills kick in, and he goes, hey, wait a minute. This is silly. My father's staff, the people who work my father's farm, they have more than enough to eat. What am I doing here? Let me go back and let me make it perfectly clear. Look, I have sinned grievously against you and against God. I am not worthy to be called your son. Don't call me your son. Let me simply work for you. But remember the motivation. He's hungry. That's it. It's selfish. It's self-centered, and it's all about his own survival. It has absolutely nothing to do with any sense or level of love or compassion that he has, for his father. There is none of that there. The guy's just hungry, and he doesn't want to starve to death, so he figures he'll go back and work, because he knows on his father's farm, his father treats his servants with an enormous amount of dignity and respect. So he figures, I'll go back, I'll work, and I won't starve to death, which I tend to be doing here. And so he heads off. Cisco, could you come up for a minute? I'm glad you showed up, because I didn't know who else to abuse and do this, but this would have been perfect. Do me a favor, just stand right here, just like that. Don't move. men in Mediterranean worlds, men do not run. They don't run. If they own property, like this man did, if they own property and they have a certain level of respect, there is absolutely no running. It is a very suave swaddling toward, the person. There is never any type of overextension. Now recognize, Luke makes it clear that the sun is still a ways off. A ways off. But you could always tell your children's walk. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. I know a couple of times, if you go to look for Arthur, it's easier now. He's taller and he's got this hair thing going on. But for Arthur, in a crowd, you could tell that it's Arthur. You could tell his movement. You could tell how he carries himself. The father from a distance, probably not even recognizing the face, could already tell by the movement. And Luke makes it absolutely clear that the father runs, right? He runs full out. And you got to imagine all the servants are asking themselves, where's he going? He's never done this before. He's never acted like this. What is the inspiration? But he's so filled with, what does Luke say? Compassion. He is so filled with compassion that he runs up, and not only does he grab him, but he kisses him. And you can imagine what that encounter must have been like. But it's not over. It's not over. See, embracing him sends a message to the servants that he's here and he's back. He begins to say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I don't deserve to be called your son. And what does the father do? Clothing was everything in Mediterranean world. Everything. What you wore symbolized who and what you were. Tells the servants, go, get the robe, wrap it around him. Now you can imagine, he's been hanging out with pigs. You can just imagine what he smells like, okay? I want this washed and back. But the fact of the matter is that in the midst of all that, he takes him and he wraps him, and he's now standing there. I would tell you to wear my sandals, I'm too big. But the next thing he does is critical in his world. See, identity for males within the community, within the family, is identified by the ring. It's all about a ring. The ring identifies the person wearing it as whose son it is. But on top of all that, it is also a credit card. He could go into any town. He could go up to any vendor, any merchant. Once they see the ring, he could get anything that he wants, takes anything he wants, and the bill will simply be sent to dad. So he restores him in every aspect of dignity. He embraces him, declaring him his son, even though the father has been wounded horribly by all of this. He engulfs him in clothing so that now he looks dignified as my son would always look. And on top of that, now he's carrying my credit card. This is my Black American Express card that I've just handed my son. This is the guy who took everything from him and squandered it all and didn't care about him at all. Didn't care about the father at all. There was nothing there. There was no sentiment. There was no love. There was there was nothing. He was just and for all practical purposes, he's still this selfish, self-centered individual, because the only reason he is standing there is because he's hungry. His motivations are all screwed up. See, and this is where this is where the Christian church has a huge problem. Every parable that Jesus says, every parable that he talks about, everything he shares, every characteristic that he brings out about the Father is exactly, Jesus is telling us, this is how the Father is. This is how the Father thinks and treats us. And we sit back and we go, no. Now this is too good to be true. You can't tell me when I take my giftedness, my talents, and I run off and I do all my own stupid stuff, that's simply approaching a slight way to God, that God, Creator, runs the rest of the way to get to us, to hold us, to pull us in, and then restores us into complete dignity as though nothing has taken place. The Father has lost half of everything he has. The Father's given it all away. And this person's taken full advantage of it and abused it. He's not coming back with anything but a horrible smell and ugly clothes. I mean, that's all he's got. And yet it doesn't matter because the Father's compassion is so great. And we have a huge problem with that. We have a huge problem because if Jesus's parables are clearly defining and explaining the characteristics of God, then we have to admit that much of what we have heard, much of what we have been taught, isn't this good news that Jesus talks about in how God treats us. Most of the time we would think that the Father should say, well, listen, you put in 90 days of work and we'll talk about it. You do a year, free service, free servitude to me, and we'll revisit it. You get me back my gifts that I gave you. You fulfill what you have stripped me of. Because that's the way we think. That's the way we operate. That's how we treat one another. Our legal system's built on that. That's how we think. And yet Jesus comes along with all of this, and it's the farthest thing. It's the farthest thing from what his audience could comprehend. Not to mention the fact that in all of his actions and everything this guy has done, he has broken every possible Jewish law that there is. He has no foundation for a relationship with God at all, and the Father could care less. He doesn't judge him by that. How does he judge him by? Compassion. It is the one most powerful word in this gospel that makes all the difference. What's the motivation? What's the desire? What does the Father want? It's compassion. And so you and I, we sit around with our foibles, and geez, we all have them. People say to me all the time, I do this, I do that, I don't go to church. Time out. I understand what you're saying. The Son had a relationship with the Father. You would hope that that relationship would have transformed the Son to have more respect, to have a better response, and greater love for the Father because of how the Father loved him. Even after the Father sits down at his request and divides his property, which is basically the Son telling him, you are dead to me, give me what's properly mine. Even when the Father does that out of love for the Son doesn't even respond, doesn't even get it. That the Father loves him so much that if that's what he wants, I'm going to let you do that. God has created each and every one of us with a free will. And sometimes we make terrible mistakes. And sometimes we make those mistakes over and over and over. And decades later, we say to ourselves, God, why I still act like this? Why am I such a self-centered person? Why can't I get over this? And so we end up staying away. We choose to stay away because we don't believe that our God can be this compassionate. We don't. We simply have to admit that most of the time we think that, as funny as it sounds, if God only knew how I truly was, he would never love me. If God really knew what I did, how I think, how I act, my desires, my motives, he wouldn't love me. Or in order for me to come back to God, I have to be perfect. I have to be sinless. I don't even know what that means. Theologically, I cannot tell you what that means because we're all broken, which is why we have Jesus, which is why we have the cross, which is why we have redemption. That redemption is not about us. It's about Jesus. It's got nothing to do with us. It's already God running toward humanity to embrace and to reestablish us into his family. Now, the son is working the farm. He's outside. And he comes back and here's all this partying and dancing, which I'm assuming is probably like in the middle of the day, which odd time to have a party, right? So great was the father's joy. He didn't say, hey, look, Saturday night, 8 o'clock, everyone's getting together and we're going to throw down, send out an invite. We'll get everybody. He didn't do any of that. Why? He is so overwhelmed with his joy and his excitement and what has just happened by his arrival that he doesn't care. And the fatted calves were only killed for religious ceremonies. High holy days, only for high holy days. That calf, they keep stuffing that thing as much food as possible because the fatter it gets, the better it is to eat. And they save it and they save it and they save it. And for only incredibly high holy days do they sacrifice and eat that lamb. What does that tell you about how the Father sees this action of the Son returning? This is a holy event to him. Now the Son comes back and he hears the dancing and stuff. He's like, it's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What's going on? And not only that, he wasn't called for. They're already having the celebration. That lamb's already, medium well, being cooked, eaten. Everyone's chowing down. And he's sort of wandering in. He wasn't invited. He wasn't informed. And now all of a sudden, he doesn't even want to go inside because the servant has said to him, that brother of yours that took the inheritance and went off and prostitutes. And he showed up today and your father is like throwing this huge party. So the son becomes indignant. We do this ourselves. How is it possible, God, that you can love someone who does horrible, terrible things and acts in certain ways? We ask that of ourselves all the time. When we make judgments of other people's actions, we immediately, somewhere down deep inside, ask ourselves, God, how is it possible that you love that person as much as you love me? And so the son won't go into the party. So we have a father who not only ran a great distance to embrace his son and bring him home, we have a father now who leaves the party to go outside and to hold a conversation with an indignant, arrogant son who refuses to come in. Another characteristic of God. Not afraid to go anywhere, break any rules, because if anything, the son, especially because he is the more righteous one in his mind, that son had the responsibility to come in and see the father. Not that the father should go outside and plead with him like a baby to come inside to the celebration. And the son is all ticked off at this point. I don't understand, Father. I have done everything you have asked me to do. I have responded to every command of yours. And yet for me and my friends, you didn't even give me a goat to celebrate with. But this is where it gets quirky, because the father says, what are you talking about? everything I have is yours. If you wanted a goat, you could have just taken the goat. And sometimes we serve God like that. We think there's certain things we have to do in order to get something from God. And I think the statement of Jesus in this gospel is kind of like, no, everything I have is yours. It's already yours. You don't see it as yours, and I don't know what to do about that because you've always been with me. You're always here. You're always around me. We live together. So everything that I have is already yours. Why do you think you have to ask for a goat? We'll deal with the goat thing later, but listen, your brother was dead. He was spiritually dead. He was cut off from the family by his own choice. But he is alive again. And so often for us, we have been sort of taught that in order for someone to come back into the fold, you have to jump through these 14 hoops in order to get there, in order to be worthy to be considered or equal or embraced by everyone else. And I'm sorry, the God that Jesus talks about is incredibly disturbing. It sets me off. It gets me very annoyed because I have a hard time comprehending that level of compassion because in my life, I have not experienced that a lot from other people. You just don't. So because you don't experience it like that from other people, you don't even think that you can attribute it to God. And so what do? Even when Jesus comes along and gives us a story and tells us exactly how God treats us, how God thinks about us, how God responds to us, that's what this gospel is saying. This is what this parable is saying. This is how God is. This story is how God is. And even in the spite of everything that Jesus puts forth for us to listen and to believe and to consider and to accept as truth because it is Jesus who is speaking about it, we still manipulate it and put limitations on it and structure it and make it appear as though somehow the human institutions have control over the compassion that comes from God and God alone. I'm telling you this morning, I don't think we really know or have experienced the God that Jesus talks about. It has been layered upon. And the problem I have with the layers that humanity has coated these stories with is then what is the good news about Jesus if we're stuck having to work hard to end up in a loving, compassionate relationship with the Father? What good news is that for us? And even as we're approaching Holy Week, the conversation will be about the crucifixion. And they will say that our sins are nailed to the cross and it will drag us down because every nail, every drop of blood. Yes, but who established that redemption? It wasn't us. It was God running to us so that we could be back in relationship with him. And we still don't capture or accept all that as being true for me. Sounds great in a book. Sounds great in a story. And I'm telling you, when Jesus' first audience heard this story, they're all sitting there going, what is he talking about? This is not the God that we were taught about. And that's the point of Jesus. You and I, everything the Father has is already ours. We have this life that is a gift. We have the Spirit that dwells within us. We have a regular, open relationship in spite of our brokenness and in spite of our selfish reasons, many times want to be in relationship with God because we need this, we need that, we need the other thing. But it doesn't change. It doesn't change what Jesus has come to tell us about. There is good news for us. There is good news for us. We just have to accept Jesus at his word. At his word. No one else's. He said this. The Son of God told us this is how the Father is. You don't think God could be that compassionate? I think that's our problem. It's not God's, because Jesus has already showed us how the Father is.